There was a man who was traveling a road from Jericho to Jerusalem, and as he was traveling, some thieves jumped out and attacked him, and they beat him within an inch of his life, and they left him laying at the road half dead. And a priest happened to be going down the road shortly after this happened, and when he saw the man, he quickly passed by on the other side. There was also a Levite who was traveling the same road, and he also saw the man, and he too passed by on the other side of the road. But then a Samaritan man came by. And when he saw the man lying half dead on the side of the road, he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil on them and giving him wine to drink. He put him on his own donkey and he carried him to an inn, and he took care of him through the night. The next morning he gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins and asked him to look after the man. He told him, "Any additional expenses you might incur through caring for him, I'll reimburse you when I return." That's a nice story, isn't it? It's one I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Maybe you've recognized it. It's the story that we've come to call the story of the Good Samaritan. And it's become an icon in both Christian literature and even in secular literature. I can remember sitting on a little square carpet remnant in my Sunday school classroom as a kid, and the teacher acted it out on a little felt board with the people who kind of followed the story, and we listened to it narrated by our teacher, who said, "And always remember that we should always be nice to people." And I think that's at least, or something like that, was the moral of the story. But this parable, this was the language of the kingdom which was coming into Jesus' midst. And in the Bible, it says that Jesus didn't speak to the crowds without speaking to them in parables. And in this parable, and in all of the other ones, there were hidden truths that were revealed to those who had open hearts and open minds. Jesus used the parables as a subversive form of communication. In his short little stories that he shared, the characters and the details were carefully selected so that he could shake up and challenge and confront, maybe even correct the perspective of those who were listening to him. And Christians have at times, we've done this, we've taken these parables and we've turned them into sweet little stories that become docile and harmless, intended to teach moral lessons to children, when most of them were perspective-shattering stories, even at times offensive to those who heard them. And this parable that we've come to know as the Good Samaritan is no different. The religious Jew would have walked away after hearing this parable offended by what Jesus had just said about him, thinking that Jesus clearly did not understand the scriptures, that Jesus clearly did not understand the culture of the crowd that he was in the midst of, and that he did not maybe even understand the Jewish religion. In a moment, I'm going to tell you the story again, but I'm going to retell it in a way that might help us to understand what Jesus was trying to say, and maybe even why people might have been alarmed or offended at the hearing of this story. Hopefully, this summer has been a good summer for you all. You've had lots of experiences in your community. I and some others from our church community have been able to participate in some of those things, and Wade's been gone, and so from what I hear, there haven't been any coups or any uprisings, and that seems like a good thing. But God has been with you, and through the different people who have spoken and the different experiences that you've had in this community, God has met you there, and He's been with you and reminding you that He's both here and He's in this community. Earlier in the spring, I think one of the first speakers to come here was Jim Sandberg. And he started, I believe, with the passage in Luke chapter 10, which was Jesus sending out his disciples. And Molly told me that his message was essentially, we need to get over ourselves and get about the things that God has called us to do. And Jesus sent his disciples out to preach and to heal and to proclaim the good news that God's kingdom is here. And then in Luke chapter 10, the very next story right after that is this story that I just told you. And now here we are at the end of the summer, and here we are back in the neighborhood. You might have heard an NPR news story that was played, I think, one time this week. You might not have heard it because there's a lot of other stories about hurricanes and catastrophes happening in different parts of our country, but there was a story that was told about a town in America. And it's a town where poverty and unemployment and opioid use and felony convictions are keeping thousands of people unemployed and unemployable. Even though you can look around this town and you can see signs saying that businesses are hiring people. This town apparently has a 4% unemployment rate. But it doesn't tell the story about a much larger percentage of the population that is unemployable because they can't pass drug screenings and they have felony convictions. The town that was highlighted in this national news story was Muncie, Indiana. I spoke with a woman this summer in South Muncie who is discouraged. And she's tired of living in her neighborhood. She lives across the street from the back of a gas station, and then there's a lot, and then there's a fence with weeds and trees that have grown up through it. And she told me one afternoon that she's tired of looking across from her porch and seeing people shoot up heroin and then pass out right across the street from her. And she was trying to figure out a way to move out of town so that she could live out in the country so she just wouldn't have to be around it. Whether or not we're away from it, whether or not we're aware of it, this is going on in the town where we live and where we call home. There are wounds and scars here that only Jesus can heal. Jesus, when he sent out his disciples, he has this interaction with this Pharisee. And of course, this interaction was about religion. And in verse 25 of chapter 10, it says, on one occasion, in Luke chapter 10, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? The man answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. And that was a thoughtful response. This teacher summed up all of God's law, everything contained within the Old Testament, in two simple statements. Loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. That's everything. And Jesus commended him for his well-articulated response. Do this, Jesus said, and you will live. Okay, the man asked, but who should I consider to be my neighbor? And for some reason, he felt that he needed to justify himself. I wonder if he was wanting to say to Jesus, let's not be too naive in who we're going to call our neighbor. Because, of course, there's reasons why we would not call certain people our neighbors. As he was doing his religious duties, he wanted his religious duty to be more about he and God and the people he liked being around rather than everyone else. Of course, there were certain people that he did not even want to consider as his neighbor. Certain people that God would not even want him to consider as a neighbor. And Jesus had a following of tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes. And his ministry stood in contradiction to the way this Pharisee understood the Torah. So posing this question to Jesus would set him apart from this defiled sort of ministry that Jesus was doing among the people. And Jesus said, all right, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus told him this parable of the Good Samaritan. Here it is in our language. And hopefully you can see through this, maybe there's something subversive about this that Jesus is trying to say to us. A man was traveling from northwest Muncie to the south side of Muncie to visit some friends. He wanted to walk through this neighborhood where he had grown up. He was well dressed, and he was using the long walk as an opportunity to get some exercise. As he was making his way through the intersections and through many abandoned buildings that he passed by of businesses that were once thriving, and he had to cross over the one bridge that is now open to get there to the south side of town. And as he walked into this neighborhood, some thugs, they were junkies really, they saw an opportunity to get some cash. And so they mugged the guy, and they took his wallet, and they beat him until he was half dead, lying at the side of the road. And they just left him lying unconscious on a sidewalk near the old abandoned Chevy plant on 8th Street. A local pastor happened to drive down the road about that time. And he looked over and he saw a man lying at the side of the road, and he looked at his watch. And he thought about the budget meeting that he was headed to and how all of these people were depending on him. And he looked nervously in the rearview mirror, and he drove by him on the other side of the street. Then 2 Ball State students, they were a part of a ministry on campus, and they just happened to be out for a prayer walk around some of the neighborhoods, but they accidentally crossed this bridge and ended up in a place that to them no longer felt safe, and then they saw the man. But what could they do? I mean, they were just a couple of students. And they didn't want to interrupt their prayer time, so they passed by him on the other side of the road, and as they passed, they offered up a prayer for him to ease their consciences. And it wasn't just those 3 individuals who passed by. There were Christians of every denomination and non-denomination alike who passed by the man thinking, I do not want to have to involve myself in this situation when I really don't know how to help. Someone who has more time, maybe someone with a gift of mercy or someone who's been trained in this area can help this man. And then a Muslim man who was headed to work at his job at the local gas station, after finishing his prayer, saw the man lying there. And he went over to him and got on his knees. And he pulled his shirt off, and he used it to wipe away the blood, and used it then to bandage the bleeding man. And he frantically started waving for someone to help, and car after car drove by until some of his friends happened to see him stooped over this man. And they stopped the car by the curb, and they loaded the man into the car, and then they drove him to a person that they knew in the community who was a doctor, who said he could bandage him up, he could stitch him up, and he could give him some medicine, but then they'd have to come do something with him because he had no identification. And so between them, they found that they had about $100. So after the doctor had done his work, they took him and they got him a room at a hotel, and they checked on him through the night. But before they left, the doctor said, you got to pay for this. I'm not offering charity cases around town, and I have a family to feed, and I have responsibilities myself. So this Muslim man gave them the doctor his name, his address, and he said he would return tomorrow with more money to pay for the costs incurred through treating this man. And so he stayed up all night, calling friends from the mosque, which he was a part of, and a group that he was aware of on campus, and he raised an additional $4,500 to help this man. Jesus said, "Which of these do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hand of robbers?" And the expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." And Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Of course, if we hear that story, something doesn't sit quite right with us about it. And of course, I exaggerated the parts that highlighted what Jesus was trying to say when he told the story about a Samaritan man. But the story and the way I told it, it almost feels like an affront to people of our faith told by the leader of our faith. It's important to realize that the characters in Jesus' stories, they were always carefully chosen. And so Jesus chose a Samaritan man to stop when the Jewish religious leaders walked right by. And that stung like a slap in the face. The Samaritans themselves were considered by the Jews to be half-breeds. Jews who had intermarried with Gentiles from the surrounding nations, and they practiced a kind of a compromised form of Judaism in their teaching, and the way the Jews viewed them, even in their teaching, they would quote a verse. The Pharisees would often quote a verse about the Samaritans, and it's Psalm 139 in verse 21, and it says, "Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and abhor those who rise up against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies." The animosity and prejudice didn't just go from the Jews to the Samaritans, but went from the Samaritans to the Jews as well. It's hard to communicate to an audience where we all probably have a lot of different perspectives about things, what Jesus was trying to get across in this parable. But Jesus was making the point that people who were known to be religious did not stop to help a person who was dying, while a foreigner, someone who is considered an outcast, a low-down, no-good Samaritan, was the only one who stopped. Maybe for some of you, the man who helped him could have been a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi. Maybe that person should have been a Trump supporter or a bleeding heart liberal. Maybe it should have been a Mormon missionary, in which case there would have been two of them. Maybe it should have been a leader of the religious right. Maybe it should have been a feminist. Maybe it should have been Bill Nye. Maybe it should have been some band that we can't imagine caring for a person. But who's the person that you think, or that you've thought, if you're honest, that God doesn't accept because of their beliefs, their views, their lifestyles? If Jesus was telling the story to you, he might have made that person stop instead of you. In the parable of the Samaritan is the one who's able to rise above the prejudice and to rise above the bigotry and to offer time, to offer himself to someone who no one else would. He's the one who is truly good in the story. In the beginning of the story, the expert in the law asked the question, "Who is my neighbor?" And at the end of this story, Jesus says the neighbor is the one who stopped. That's the neighbor. I think if Jesus' main message in this parable is, if in our faith we are not good people, then what is the good of our faith? If we are not good people, then what good is the faith that we proclaim? The priest, the Levite in the parable, they both had faith, but they were not good people. They wouldn't take their time to help someone who really needed it. And the implication, of course, was that their faith was not very good. And then along comes a Samaritan who was a reject. He was a compromiser as far as faith is concerned. And yet Jesus commended him because he was good. E. Stanley Jones, who was a missionary who traveled the world boldly proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ all over the world, he said this about knowing Mahatma Gandhi. He said, "He taught me more of the Spirit of Christ than anyone in the East or in the West." Gandhi, who, at least as far as we know, was not a believer in Jesus, lived a life that was good, and no one really debates that. He could be the Good Samaritan of our modern Christian era. Maybe not the person who we would expect that would be giving us a picture of what the kingdom life that God is calling us into should look like. In case you hadn't noticed, we are living in a country that is divided. Strongly divided. We live in a time of very heightened racial tensions, and tension that comes from suspicion and who has power and who doesn't have power. And there's a deep divide that cuts right in the heart of our society, in fact, right in the heart of our very community. And our response to that is that we can either be caught up in the world's desire for power and money and achieving those things, and on the other side, often in our religion, we're just looking as much as we can to leave this place and get to heaven. And neither of those answers addresses the person who's sitting in the ditch on the side of the road. In our faith, for too long here in the Western world, it's been less and less about the renewal of God's creation and the transformation and incarnation that's happening in communities, and more about escaping from this wicked world to get to a better place called heaven. Churches have long become fortresses, places to escape this world, and we gather and we look around and we look to heaven and we meditate and we pray. And we anticipate that ultimately we're all going to die, and this is all going to be better. And this is one way, I think, that we try to make sense out of all the materialism and all the violence and all the pain and all the suffering that we see around us. If we're religious people, of course we would have sympathy for the battered man on the side of the road. But our message to him often is, we can only help you a little bit. Because it doesn't matter, we're all going to escape this wicked world when we go to heaven. And though there is a hint of truth to that, there's also a hint of error with it. The secular world too, they pass by the person in the ditch, and they do it because there's a profit to be made. There's power to be grabbed onto. And maybe they'll throw a little bit of money at the problem, but it's not going to stop them from gaining profits and achieving power in order to bend down and help the person who's in the ditch. But the kingdom of God is now bursting forth into the world from the time that Jesus came until now. In this world where people are living in a ditch. And the living God has come with healing and hope through Jesus Christ. And he's picked up this battered and dying world, has bound up its wounds, and is setting it on the road to health and healing. And this is the practical work that Jesus has called us to in Muncie, Indiana. It's time for us to roll up our sleeves and to get about the work of bringing hope and healing through Jesus Christ to the addicts of Muncie, to the unemployed in our town, to the homeless and the prostitutes, to the junkies. It's time for us to be a neighbor to them. I've had the privilege this summer of spending some time in South Muncie, and it wasn't even something I really planned to do. During the summer, being in campus ministry, we have just time available to us in the summers, and so we thought about this idea to team up with this local pastor and to start a community meal. And through doing this, something has happened. A few people from that church, a few people from our church, we actually have met some people who live in that neighborhood, and they're the kind of people that I'm telling you about. They're on drugs, and some of them are homeless, and very few of them have jobs, and most of them have felony records, and they live in this neighborhood, and they kind of transition from home to home. After getting evicted from one, they move to the next one, and they are both literally and figuratively in the ditch. And there's people from the mission that I've met, and parents who send their kids out to the streets to be raised by them, and there's alcoholics there, and this is one of 5 or 6 different neighborhoods in Muncie that are almost identical. And these are not my people. These are not the people that I grew up with. These are not even the people that I live next to. This isn't my story. But God has been pulling at my heart and calling me to be a neighbor to them. I was leaving a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I saw Donnie. He was walking across the bridge over by Bruner's, and he was limping. He actually had a friend who was helping him walk, and I recognized Donnie because I met him a couple of months ago at one of these meals. We hadn't seen him for a couple of weeks, and the word kind of in the neighborhood was that he was in the hospital. Of course, no one knew his last name and knew any way to get in touch with him. But there he was walking over the bridge, and I rolled down my window, and I was like, Donnie, hey. He said, hey, Neil. And I said, I'll come pick you up and give you a ride home. So I pulled over, and his friend left, and he told me that he had just gotten out of the hospital. And he had asked the nurses if he could leave early, and I think he ended up just leaving. But he really probably wasn't in a very good condition to do that. And so we were driving him home, and on the way home, I asked him if he had any food in his house. And he said that he didn't, but that he would get some in a couple days. And I said, well, how about I take you over to Aldi? And he said, yeah, I have a couple dollars on my EBT card. And so we went over there and got some food for him, and then on the way home, we were talking, and this was one of many conversations that I've had with Donnie about the struggles in his life, and he said, you know, I want to help some of the people in my neighborhood who are on drugs and are addicted to drugs. And I said, Donnie, aren't you addicted to drugs? He said, yeah. I said, what about if you started experiencing Jesus yourself? And then we're actually able to help people with that same message. He said, yeah, I probably should start with me first, shouldn't I? And we talked, and he said, you know, I think I'm changing, though. These conversations that we're having and showing up at the church and these different experiences, I'm starting to feel like maybe there's more hope for me. He's actually a really good guitar player, and I've got to sit down and listen to him play, and he's come to a couple of gatherings of some people that I know, and I'm not sure, but I think we're becoming friends. I'm not sure I would ever have become friends with Donnie before. But he's starting to come alive, and there are hundreds of Donnies that live in a 5-block radius of this one little neighborhood on the south side of Muncie. I've been in college ministry for almost 25 years, and I do not know the first thing about helping people get off drugs. We're helping people with chronic joblessness. We're helping people try to get a job with a felony record. I don't know how to do any of that. But I do know how to pray, and I think I know how to be a friend to someone, and I know that Jesus has power to heal, And Jesus has power to transform. And I also know that God said that he was going to build his church and that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And I actually believe that. I believe that he will do that right here in Muncie, Indiana. But I know that the things standing in the way seem like insurmountable obstacles from a humanly perspective. But I know that if we can help a person take a step, that eventually the enemy is defeated. And that's what we do with college students every day. Help them take a step, another step toward God, another step toward Christ, another step away from sin. Now, I'm still going to do work with college students, just like all of us are going to continue to do the things that God has called us to do. But now I'm also doing a little bit with a few people that I see walking around town, and I know their names. Actually, in this little neighborhood, 50% of the people's names are either Donnie, Lonnie, or Johnny. So it's a pretty good bet you're going to get one of them. But they know my name too. And I think I prefer that. I ride my bike through the streets of Muncie and I see people I know, and now I stop and talk with them now. And of course, this changes my plans a little bit at times. I may run into a situation that takes some time or some cost, or maybe my comfort, or I can say, well, this isn't my job. But now I'm also a neighbor in Muncie to some people that I was not a neighbor to before. And these people are in the ditch. So much so that they did a national news story on our town just this week. The story that we looked at today operates on a couple of levels. At the simplest and most obvious, it's an invitation for us to action. A life of self-giving love, a life that's prepared to roll up our sleeves and to help no matter what it takes. No matter what we feel like we have to offer, no matter what season we are in life, just to bend over and help a person who's struggling. This is an invitation to the work of the kingdom that we're called to, and we have to freshly commit ourselves to the kingdom of God and to the work that Jesus was doing. We heard the verse this morning as we were giving our offerings. Whatever you've done for the least of these, you've done for me. In Isaiah 58, it says, is this not the kind of fasting that I've chosen? The prophet was confronting those who were fasting, who were doing their religious duties, but were not engaged in the world around them. Is this not the kind of fasting I've chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, and when you see the naked to clothe them, and to not turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear, and then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. And it's our prayer, of course, that we would see Jesus all over this community. At a deeper level, this story of the Good Samaritan, it's a story that's meant to split our worldview wide open and to see things through a new and unexpected perspective. Instead of just seeing a closed world where the kingdom of God is those Christians who are kind of gathered all around Muncie, to see that the despised and the feared Samaritan is a neighbor and can be a part of us and what we're doing. We're traveling this pilgrim road, and as we do it, we're a signpost of hope to this world that's in desperate need. Hope in Jesus, hope in forgiveness, hope in healing and transformations, and we have to commit ourselves freshly to that. As I close here, I want to tell you about someone that I met actually here in this church. I was having a donut downstairs, and I sat down at a table, and I met a nice lady who told me that she had started coming around to this church. And she then opened up to me and shared some of her story. I asked her this morning if I could actually share a little bit of that. She had recently come from Kentucky to get a new start here, and she was facing a very big set of challenges. She had a sister who was very ill. She had family who was struggling. She was facing her own sets of challenges, being new to the area, not knowing very many people, trying to figure out how to keep in touch with family members, not having all the things that she needed to live. And she was meeting people right here in this church who were helping her with rides, helping her get a few things for her home. And she was experiencing help and healing in relationships. And at that moment, I remember when I met her, I thought, okay, this is what we're talking about all summer, joining God in what He's doing in the neighborhood. I spoke with her on the phone this week, and she was telling me how thankful she was that God brought her here to First Baptist. And about all the things that people were doing for her here, especially Brother Larry. I kept hearing all the things that Brother Larry was doing for her. She told me the first time I met her that she's played piano her whole life. So I asked her if she'd play a song for us this morning. And this is, I think, just a great way for us to finish up the summer. So Paula Furnish is going to play a song for us this morning. And I just want to say, this is what God is doing in the neighborhood. He's bringing people to be a part of us, to belong to us, and we can belong to them, and people that we can love, and they can love us and serve us, and we can know each other. So, Paula, thank you.